A good sidekick is worth their weight in gold. Maybe that's why sometimes the henchmen of James Bond are more memorable than the villains. At times it feels like all the color and creativity was invested in the sidekicks, and the main rogue can't help but feel a little bland. I addressed this phenomenon a little bit in my Bond villains ranking video, and despite that, some people expressed disappointment that I didn't talk about certain characters there, as the apprentice sometimes overshadowed the master in their eyes. In many cases, I couldn't agree more, and yet I had a relatively strict criteria for what I considered to be the main villain for that list. This is yet another video where I have to set some ground rules for the list to follow. As I began to compile all of the names that would count as henchmen, I laid out each film and then tried to determine from that list who was the principal henchman, so I'd only have one per film. While this was relatively easy for the majority of the series, I ran into a problem, and I'll illustrate with an example. Live and Let Die has a great ensemble of villains, but who would you say is the main henchman? For my money, that would be Teehee. But then, I'd be passing up the opportunity to talk about Baron Samedi, who has had much longer staying power with the fandom. Another example would be License to Kill. I would argue it's Milton Krest, but then I'd be missing Dario from a lineup, and I know I'd be crucified for leaving him out. So I'm open to picking 2 people per film if I think the film in question has a second person that merits a place on the list, and I feel like I have enough to talk about with each of them. That doesn't mean that there will be 2 henchmen per film, but at least 6 films have qualified for that criteria. And yet there's one more film even beyond that I had to make an exception for 3 characters, and I hope you'll see why when we get to them. As this can somewhat be seen as a companion piece to the main villains ranking video, you may have expected that everyone I didn't cover there will be tackled here. And yet that will not be the case, as including every person that counts as a henchman would have taken up far too much time, and a lot of the entries would have amounted to me calling them variations of the phrase functional background people. So if there's a specific character you feel like I should have discussed, feel free to leave a comment and I will try to leave a response. So with that, let's get started with today's list.
What makes you think that M, the head of British intelligence, will oblige you by falling in with your plan?
For the simple reason that this is so obviously a trap. My reading of the British mentality is that they always treat a trap as a challenge.
If I were to redo the villains ranking list today, I think I would have to give in and give Kronsteen a slot there, though he never would have been that high. I'll be brief here. I like the idea of the chess master metaphor with him, and yet Kronsteen never leaves that much of an impression on me. In a book where Fleming could be a bit more self-indulgent with how many characters he included, Kronsteen worked fine. But for something like a film where conciseness is an important aspect in adaptation, I think it would have been best to have combined him with someone else, be it Blofeld or Klebb. In that sense, I think the 2005 video game had the right idea and improved on that bit of the story. I guess he just suffers from too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome, and that superfluousness is why he would never have been a high ranker.
Sorry.
How much longer?
Nowadays, I think the Craig films are getting quite the backlash, and while most of that is unwarranted to me, I can't argue with anyone that wants to complain about the assortment of henchmen and villains. I like Quantum of Solace more than most people, but does anyone actually like Elvis or think about him when they're thinking of henchmen? I mean, okay, so let's count the things that are unique about him. He's weird looking, He's got a wig? Yeah, that's about all I got. I know the Craig era was trying to stay more grounded and not have the cartoony vibe that some of the Brosnan films had. But being more grounded and darker and realistic does not automatically equate to being better. And this guy just has nothing to go off from. I find it curious that the bonus features for Quantum's home media releases include an actor's diary from Anatole Taubman, because, you know, there's no one else from that cast I'd love to hear from. So it should be no surprise that Elvis takes the lowest spot on my list.
Good. Hans? You will see that my piranha fish get very hungry.
I think You Only Live Twice has a real problem coming up with some solid, memorable henchmen, and Hans is the worst of the bunch. He really has nothing interesting going for him. He doesn't say anything, he doesn't do anything, he's just there as a silent strongman. Hans is the first on our list that we're going to see of the strong, blonde henchman variety. I guess the unique things about him are his fight with Bond, which isn't really that unique, and his death, which was done better previously in the film. All of the other Connery films have some fine henchmen, and this guy's the first real misstep that the series makes for me in this department.
East German champion?
Isn't he beautiful?
You know something, BB? You're fickle.
For Your Eyes Only is my favorite Roger Moore film of the series, and yet the biggest issue that film has for me is the villains roster. No one is particularly great here. Eric Kriegler has a bit more to him than Hans does, in that he actually plays a role in the story because he's the link between Christatos and General Gogol, but he's almost equally forgettable. He has a fair introduction. I like that he just shrugs off BB Doll's advances, but he's not got enough of a presence to stand out from any of the other henchmen. His death is also pretty embarrassing, in that he gets distracted by his boss leaving the room and Bond seizes the moment. This is pretty pathetic, and I almost hate myself for saying this about one of my favorite films of the series.
Yes?
Sir, the man we want is Emil Locque, an enforcer in the Brussels underworld.
Ouch, second henchman in a row from For Your Eyes Only. Emil Locque fares a bit better than Kriegler, but only just. Now, I just adore his death scene. Roger's era is well known for its more lighthearted tone, and while that's generally true, there are a few really good, colder moments from his version of the character, and this is the best of the lot. However, the problem is that the scene isn't great because it's this character getting that exit, so it hardly feels fair to count it in his favor. He functions as an executioner, he's not a physically imposing character, and there's something really piercing about his stare, which are all things that I guess I like, so his presence in the story is welcome, but there is no real development of the guy, so I don't feel comfortable putting him above any of the other selections on this list. However, he's not a blight on the movie like I think Kriegler is.
What now?
Just have to raise the money.
But how?
How? By playing baccarat.
Casino Royale from 1967 is more of a vignette film than it is a solid, sustained narrative, and so there are a few people you could count as being the primary henchmen, most notably Vesper and Agent Mimi. Yet when I consider the film as a finished piece, the most prominent in my mind is Le Chiffre, which is baffling to me. A man who is the main villain in the original novel and whose other cinematic film incarnation would go on to be one of my favorite villains in the series, Orson Welles' interpretation feels really out of place. The film has so little to do with the original story that the credits even say suggested by the novel rather than based on. I get the idea that Le Chiffre may needed to have been included for rights issues, but he contributes so little to this film's story, or lack of story thereof, that anyone not in the know about the production history of this film might ask why the character is here, or why they wasted such great talent as Orson Welles here. Le Chiffre seems to be more interested in distracting people from the card game than he does in actually taking the game seriously. His life depends on the outcome, much like it does in the books, so what's the deal here? It's clear to me that Wells is here for the paycheck and isn't interested in the role per se, so he comes up with anything to make the role fun for him to play, which I guess I do appreciate if he's not going to be a solid adaptation of the character. He actually reminds me a little bit of Marlon Brando, who was notoriously difficult to work with and would sometimes suggest bizarre things during the productions of his films for the characters to do or be. And I know at least the magic tricks were something that Wells asked for to be in the film. I think most fans are like myself and would probably consider this version of Le Chiffre a real letdown considering the caliber of acting talent that is here.
Blofeld sends his regards. You know, Madeleine, she's a daughter of Spectre.
Primo stands out for actually being memorable given his limited screen time. I love his fights with Bond, particularly the end fight on the stairwell. The actor Dali Bensala brings quite a bit of energy to the role, and there's something about him that reminds me of both Dan Levy and Alan Cumming. Much like Boris Grishenko within the film GoldenEye, Primo seems to come out of the more comic book type era that Roger Moore and Sean Connery's villains do, and yet it never upsets the balance of that film too much for me. However, No Time to Die is just too stuffed with characters and plot to give this guy much of a real chance to make an impression beyond what he can, which might not be fair to him. But I'm not sure what could have been done to that film that would have both served its story and given this guy a chance to have a better spotlight within the cast. I do like what was done with him though, and so that's why he's at this place on the list.
Hard to get, extremely expensive, and only used by a select few. Recognize anyone? Him.
There are a couple of films in this series where I would argue that they don't really have true henchmen for the main villain that are worth a discussion, but if I had to pick someone to represent Skyfall on this list, it would be Patrice. A hired henchman that Bond chases throughout this film, he's pretty effective at what he does, and that's about it. Now, I'm not knocking Skyfall for treating him like this. This is exactly what he should be for this story. I like both of his fight scenes with Bond, particularly the one in Darkness. And yet, much like Primo, the film just doesn't have enough room for him to be more than what he needs to be for the story to work. I do find it curious that Spectre makes him one of the tentacles on Q's computer when he's talking about how all of Bond's villains have led back to Blofeld. So I guess the series wanted us to remember him? Come on, Spectre, don't make Patrice more of a thing than he is. He was just a plot mover of a character. Nothing more.
I am.
Mm-hmm. You should give up smoking. Cigarettes are very bad for your chest.
Mr. Osato believes in a healthy chest.
Really?
Helga Brandt was always going to have a hard time being the next female henchman after Fiona Volpe. She does have some fire of her own, though. The main difference that I like is her death scene, which I actually think is far more effective than Fiona's. It's a pretty gruesome way to go, being eaten by piranhas, and it's one of my favorite bits from that film. I think ultimately my problem with the character is that within the context of the series and coming just after Fiona, she seems like a knockoff and thus blends into the background for me. Now, I know some people are going to want me to talk about Mr. Osato, that he should take one of the henchman slots for You Only Live Twice, but not only do I actually remember Helga apart from this film, I have nothing interesting to say about Osato. He's a functional character, so I decided to axe him since this was already a fairly long list. Thankfully, Helga Brandt does have a couple of good scenes of her own, and she is a fun presence within a film that is usually pretty fun, but yeah, sorry, it's a tough competition.
If you'll forgive me, your appearance here has forced me to move up my timetable slightly. I'll leave you in the capable hands of Mr. Stamper and his toys.
There are some things I really like about Stamper from Tomorrow Never Dies. Seeming to be highly impervious to actual physical pain and learning the art of chakra torture are the kinds of aspects I want to see in a Bond henchman. But because Stamper comes after so many others that did colorful things like this and added something else to their roles, he's a bland character amongst the roster. He performs his job without any real distinction, and I do like that there's actually a point to having him be a separate character from Henry Gupta and Dr. Kaufman, who I just adore, but doesn't get enough presence within the film for me to count him for this list. And yet, functional to me is just that. Functional. Without much more going for him, there are no real distinctions for him to be bumped up that much higher on this list.
You know, I've missed your sparkling personality.
How's that for a punchline?
Kill him.
I think few henchmen in the series help to drive the plot forward of their respective films more than Zhao. Rick Yoon feels like a fun choice for a henchman to me, and he's the one Bond is after for most of the first act, much like Patrice was in Skyfall. But therein lies the problem. Once Colonel Moon is revealed to be alive again through the persona of Gustav Graves, and we have a main villain to take center stage, Die Another Day seems to have no use for Zhao, and it gets rid of him quite quickly. He does participate in a fantastic car chase, though. The diamonds embedded in the face feels like it fits right at home with the classic mold of Bond henchmen, and I do chuckle at his punchline joke. I just wish there was a bit more to endear this guy to me and he lasted a little bit longer, but oh well. At least he gets a solid death.
Who are you working for, Professor?
Well, you might as well know, as you won't live to use the information. I'm working for...
Mr. Smith & Wesson. And you've had your 6.
Honestly, Professor Dent has as much to do with the story as people like Miss Tarot and the Three Blind Mice, so I could have just copped out and said that the Dr. No film has no primary henchman. However, the cold kill with Professor Dent cements the character as one that most fans remember and would consider a highlight of the film, so here we are. Dent is an example of how far Dr. No's tentacles stretch beyond Crab Key. He's probably the key agent in Kingston for this story, since he may have given the Doctor the intel needed for the murders at the beginning. He's not a particularly strong or worthy adversary to Bond, but if he just remembered how many bullets his gun held, he might have gotten away with murder until M sent 008 or something. Anthony Dawson does what he can for the role, and it's a pretty thankless one, yet it must have counted for something because Dawson reappears in 2 later installments as Blofeld. Dent did lead to a great character-defining scene for Bond, and he is important to the story of the film, so I've got to include him on this list.
Shoot.
Dave Bautista's Mr. Hinx doesn't exactly fit with the more serious vibe of Spectre. He feels a little out of place. But since I've made it clear that that film's tone bores me and makes me long for something a little bit more colorful, he's actually someone I wish was utilized more. The stone thumbnails feels like they're part of the same creative wheelhouse of ideas that Oddjob's hat and Jaws' teeth are. Squeezing the eyeballs to hurt or kill someone is right out of the Shakespeare Handbook of Villainy, so Hinx is an indicator of the type of characters and tone I would like to see out of films coming after No Time to Die. His death is a bit too quick for me, though I do like the train fight that leads up to it. I think for the most part, fans would consider Mr. Hinx to be one of the better henchmen of the Craig era, but that's probably because the creators actually finally started trying to give the henchmen some more memorable aspects.
Well, I'm not convinced. Necros can do it.
I've worked with the Russians. My appearance and methods are well known to them. It could jeopardize my comrades struggling for world revolution who depend upon me.
So now we come to our 4th blonde henchman on this list. Necros is exactly no one's favorite in this category, and yet he fares a lot better than you might think. We do spend a fair amount of time with him, he does have a personality, and he does get 2 really good fight scenes. I also love how quickly and comfortably he slides into his various disguises, which helps to add some credibility to this guy as a successful assassin. By design, though, he's not a very colorful character, and I think that's because the filmmakers are trying not to upset the balancing act The Living Daylights is undergoing between the more dramatic aspects that the Dalton era was starting to bring in and the more lighthearted elements that Roger Moore was known for. So that's why Necros can't be higher. Yet, I've personally not got much to hurl against this guy as a henchman. He's an effective part of the film. No more, no less.
He'll give you the money.
He doesn't work that way. You better watch yourself, girlie. I've known him a long time. I've seen a lot of girls like you come and go.
License to Kill's Milton Krest is a crucial arm of Sanchez's operation. He carries out the drug deals in Miami under the guise of an Oceanic Research Institute, and it seems like he has a solid command over his own group of minions. I think the scene with Lupe on the yacht where he's drunk is noteworthy and helps to give him an edge. He's been around long enough that he's not worried about his standing with Sanchez, and he's even willing to sleep with or rape Lupe for his own enjoyment. His death is by far the most gruesome of the series, and while the man is certainly deserving of some kind of cruel exit, I can't help but feel sorry for him because he's not getting killed for anything he actually did. He is a bit lower than I would like, though. When I wrote down all the characters I wanted to include on this list, this is just where he ended up, and I couldn't make a strong argument for placing him higher. He's another functional character like Necros and serves that function well, so kudos.
Now write this. The greatest rapture in my life was afforded me in a boat in Nassau by Fatima Blush. Sign, James Bond, 007.
Given my less than kind things to say about Never Say Never Again, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Fatima Blush would have been pretty low on my list. On the contrary, she's my highlight of that film. She's not exactly the same type of villain as Fiona Volpe, and I don't think she should have been. She embodies a lot of the creative spark I feel this film could have had. She's a different slant and stands out enough on her own to be a great addition to the roster. She loves her work, she's full of deranged laughter, she has an energy about her and an enthusiasm to be volunteered for a lot of the dirty work, and she has a great quirkiness about her. She gets killed a bit too quickly for me, though her death scene is pretty great. I always love villains that are unhinged enough to laugh just as they're about to die. No James Bond film is without merit for me, and she's the shining recommendation from one of my least favorite films in the series.
Bang! Gone! I am invincible! Was it good for you too?
I'm getting some coffee.
I'm going for a cigarette.
Alright, here was the thing you were waiting for. When I got to GoldenEye in my initial construction of this list, it was the film where I finally had to expand my limitation of just 2 henchmen maximum per film, because I couldn't not talk about Boris Grishenko. He doesn't start out as a bad guy, just a sleazebag who thinks he's God's gift to the world. It's pretty funny to me to watch him act in denial to the fact that he's not very charming, and yet that intentional lack of charm is actually what endears him to me, if that makes sense. He plays an important role in Trevelyan's plan, and I love his over-the-top death. It's actually kind of amazing because he feels the most out of place in the villains roster in that film, and yet he never seriously undermines the tone. I think it's mainly the fact that he's not even the best henchman in his own film that keeps him down for me. Alan Cumming is a delight whenever he's on screen, and his twitch with the pen has always stayed with me, though it's not all fun and games. His outburst with Natalia is kind of riveting to me, actually, and I do feel for his anxiety towards the end. Boris is just overall great fun, and while he's not a particularly threatening henchman to me, he deserves to be this high on the list for pure entertainment value alone.
Mr. Bond,
Ah, Miss Frost.
I'll show you your room.
A palace of ice. You must feel right at home.
Rosamund Pike's Miranda Frost was quite a surprise to me. Not only does she live up to her name, but she's actually intimidating for a good chunk of the film and feels like an effective henchman. My main issue with her is her integration into Die Another Day's story. I'm fine with her being the one that betrays Bond to Moon and Zhao during the pre-title sequence, but the film's reveal about that feels like it's not playing fair with the audience. She's not someone we would have even considered because she wasn't introduced until halfway through the film, which takes place 14 months after the events in North Korea. So it doesn't feel satisfying to have her be the traitor. As an audience, we think she's working with Graves, then we find out she's an MI6 agent, so we think she can be trusted, and then the reveal is back to what we initially thought about her, that she's loyal to Graves and compromised. That seems off to me. Part of my reluctance to accept this could be because we just had the first turncoat MI6 agent 3 films earlier, which of course was stellar. Her death is also a sticking point for me, but not because I'm sad to see her go. It's because that moment is really cringy. The setup, the payoff, and Jinx's line that spells out the irony for us. Ugh. Regardless, Miranda Frost is a highlight of a film that I really don't care for all that much.
Where'd you find the Book of Mormon? Political appointee. Not my choice.
Billy Magnuson's Logan Ash brings a quirky energy to No Time to Die that makes him someone I love to hate. He starts off as a seemingly nervous neophyte agent, with Bond giving a great quip about him, and then it's revealed that he's much more competent and is indeed Safin's agent. His giddiness about his job from this point on is really what reminds me of the classic stock of Bond henchmen that I love. His death in this film is one of my favorite parts. Seeing Bond cold kill someone is always a win for me, and especially after this guy has earned that painful death for killing Felix Leiter. So in that way, I think it actually improves upon Locke's death from For Your Eyes Only, which is a highlight that I've mentioned before. After giving us 4 rather routine and uninspired henchmen in a row on this list, I think the Craig era has finally delivered someone that could be an understandable inclusion on someone's favorite henchman list.
I always knew death would wear a familiar face, but not yours. To watch over this pleasure, Mr. Bond.
Mr. White is a strange pick to represent Casino Royale in that he doesn't actually work for Le Chiffre, the main villain of the piece. So you could make the argument that it should be Dimitrios here. But like so many others, I've got really nothing interesting to say about Dimitrios. The other reason why Mr. White is here is because he plays such a large role in the Craig era that it seemed wrong not to at least include him on this list. He represents the presence of larger masters at work during the first film, which is necessary for the story, although you'd be forgiven for not remembering him. In Quantum, he's a loose end, and remains so throughout the film, but I must say I love that he shows back up for the Quantum meeting at the opera. By the time we got to Skyfall, most of us figured he was gone from the story and we could just forget about him. However, Spectre brought him back and made him integral to the story again. Being the father of Madeline is a bit odd, but his single scene adds so much to that film for me. It's understated, to the point, and chilling. In fact, I think his scene does more to help me accept Blofeld as a powerful and shadowy figure than the boardroom scene from earlier, which actually portrayed him as such. Jesper Christensen does the best he can with a fairly minimal role, and I really applaud his efforts in all 3 of his films.
I hope you're proud of what you did to her. I'm afraid it is you who deserve credit. When I took her, she was promise itself.
I know some people take some issue with calling Renard a henchman, but put me squarely in the camp of Elektra being the main villain for The World Is Not Enough. Renard does turn Elektra evil before the start of that story, but he serves her schemes throughout the film and doesn't seem to have his own unique goals. He even seems to think that blowing up the submarine will be the last act in his life, so I'm not comfortable even putting him as a co-villain like I am with a lot of other films. That said, he has a lot of potential going out the gate. Renard's insensitivity to pain is a great idea, and I love how thematically, much like Mr. Freeze from the Batman series, an argument could be made that he's one of the most passionate villains because of his motivations, despite his ruthlessness and cold exterior, which might suggest otherwise. Robert Carlyle livens up every scene he is in. But I wish he took the wheel more in driving the film's plot forward, particularly in the third act. The way the film builds him up, he seems to be one of the greatest threats to the world's security, and once we actually get to him, he feels more like a standardized villain. The shell of this egg is terrific, but the yolk feels a little rotten to me. He's not an awful henchman, far from it, but especially when compared with Elektra, and given how much he actually doesn't drive the film's plot forward, he's a little less memorable than I would like. Yet he is indeed memorable, and I love a lot of his bits and what he does bring to the story, so that's why he's at this point on this list.
Is he armed?
You can't be too careful in New York City these days.
One of the many things I love about Live and Let Die is the roster of villains, and while Teehee isn't my favorite of the bunch, he's certainly fun to watch. The unique hook for a hand is a great idea, and despite his name, he does have threatening moments where you can tell he's someone to watch out for. Julian Harris correctly judges that balance in his performance, and he works well in the entourage. I guess my main problem is I want just a little bit more from him in some way to make him stand out, and I can't quite put my finger on what exactly I want. Maybe if he were involved in the boat chase a little bit more, some more of the action, I'd be satisfied. But everyone in the action has to fail or die, and I do love his death at the end, so maybe I should just keep my mouth shut and enjoy his part in the film as is. Teehee is a character that just brings a smile to my face whenever he comes back into the film.
As this council is aware, 72 hours ago, a secret weapon system codenamed GoldenEye was detonated over Severnaya. As head of Space Division, I personally undertook the investigation.
I think General Ourumov needs to be discussed more amongst the fandom. He's the sobering dose of grounded reality to the other two colorful henchmen. He motivates the plot for the first 2/3 of the film, and I love that he's big enough of a character that I could have seen him as a proper villain to one of the other films. He allows for Trevelyan to have appeared to have died, and so disappears off MI6's radar. He steals the Tiger helicopter, he steals the GoldenEye, and he tries to throw Mishkin off of Yanis's trail. Gottfried John is a really solid presence throughout the film. My issue here is that his death is given no real fanfare, which is odd given all the positives I just stated about the character. I'm not saying it needed to be a grandiose exit. I actually like that he's just shot by Bond, but I would have loved just an extra shot on his still corpse, or maybe a shot on Bond's face as he thinks about the man's life that he just ended. I just need a little bit more as he dies. It's a relatively soft blunder though, as Ourumov still stands somewhat tall amongst this large roster of henchmen.
Mrs. Whistler did want some pictures of the canals for the children.
How kind of you, Mr. Kidd. The children will be so thrilled.
I don't know how the rest of the fandom feels about Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, but I think they're a hoot to watch, and they're probably the best characters in Diamonds Are Forever, apart from Tiffany Case for me. The first real henchman duo of the series, Wint and Kidd instantly set themselves apart from the previous villains and lean right into the camp in a good way. It's the kind of quirky fun you'll see from villains in Live and Let Die. They do have their moments where you can buy them as threats, and yet they take such joy in their work that I can't help but enjoy watching them. Once again, the demise is one of my few issues. Mr. Kidd's is great and horrific, but Mr. Wint's tail between his legs bomb explosion feels a little mundane for me. Oh well, I'll take what I can get out of this film. Diamonds is a film I enjoy, but is occasionally in danger of falling into the bad camps of films in the series if I'm not just in the right mood for it. However, I always look forward to rewatching this film, partly for Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd.
Well, so far I can't complain about the valet service.
Dinner, 8 o'clock.
Gobinda is an attempt to capture the magic of the mostly silent henchmen that we've done a few times before. And while he doesn't measure up to the tall standard already set by those efforts, he's a pretty great attempt at that. He's got a unique look about himself. I love the sword that he uses, and his death scene is one of the best in the series. While he does go out on the plane to kill Bond, he hesitates. He's such a fun muscle man to Kamal Khan. There's nothing particular about what he says or does that's funny to me, but there's a weird, dark joy about having him around. It's a lot like Mola Ram in the Temple of Doom. He's not a fully fleshed out character, but he is a welcome presence. He's used just about the right amount for me throughout the film, and if it wasn't for the rest of this list, he'd really have nothing standing against him for being in the top tier of henchmen.
Good morning, boss.
Morning.
It's sure going to be a beautiful day. Yes, sir, a beautiful day.
Baron Samedi has such a unique mystique about him that he remains a key image out of the film he was born from. I can never tell if he actually has supernatural powers, or if he's just an actor that plays into the mystical threat, and I think that's a great way to handle that mystery. He certainly has become a fixture of the franchise afterwards, often being used as a playable character in the multiplayer sections for many video games. The best use was GoldenEye for the N64, where he's the main boss of the final unlockable level at the Egyptian temple. He retains a similar air of mystery about him. I'll talk more about his use in that game if I ever get around to doing a full review, but for now, let me say that I just have mixed to positive feelings about including him there. As for Live and Let Die, he lights up every moment he's on screen, and Jeffrey Holder has such a commanding presence that my eyes are drawn to him constantly. It's weird because I think he's a little superfluous in the story. Now, don't lynch me for saying that. All I mean is that the film is stuffed with other henchmen that all form different roles, and they feel like they go together in this entourage. Baron Samedi feels like another world apart from these guys. And yet maybe that's why we as a fan base tend to remember him so much. His minimal screen time holds him back a bit, but he's a strong contender in this competition.
Bonjour, Monsieur Bond. I am Nack. Monsieur Scaramanga will welcome you personally.
Roger was blessed with some great henchmen, wasn't he? Nack is a manservant that's never openly against Scaramanga while in his service, yet he's also got his own agenda which involves his master's death, so it adds an extra layer to this character. I love the bit at the end of the pre-title sequence where they chat about this. Scaramanga's arrogance shines through here, as he doesn't seem to be that afraid that Nack will find anyone that can match him in skill, and yet he must love the challenge, as I imagine this is how he keeps his edge up. It's an intriguing relationship that helps add some dimension to a film that is in sore need of it. Plus, I love the idea of a small rat being a nuisance to Bond that's far more effective than he'd cared to admit. The size contrast between Nack and Scaramanga leads to a fun visual juxtaposition between the two. Hervé Villechaize deserves a lot of the credit for substantially injecting personality into this character. The Man with the Golden Gun is certainly not a favorite film of mine, but I've always been very vocal about how much I love Scaramanga and Nack and how they're real highlights of Roger's entire era.
Sir Hilary Bray, Baronet.
The same, dear lady.
I'm Fräulein Irma Bunt, personal secretary to the Count.
How'd you do?
Have you had a good journey?
No, quite intolerable. I'm not a good traveler, I'm afraid.
Ilse Steppen's Irma Bunt is a really striking figure. She seems to be a throwback to colder female characters like Rosa Klebb, and yet she's entirely different. She facilitates Blofeld's plan, and she's quite fun to watch. There's an almost compelling coldness about her. Obviously, there's no way she'd seriously be involved in the physical action, though I do wonder where she's at during the assault on Piz Gloria towards the end, since she was involved in a solid car chase earlier. She's also the person wielding the gun that kills Tracy, which has gotta earn her some credibility. She's one of the very few people on this list not only to survive her film, but to still be at large. Like a lot of people, I really wanted to see her in Diamonds Are Forever and have Bond face off against her there, but oh well. She's not quite in the top tier of henchmen for me, but she is very memorable and always leaves me wanting more with her.
Where's my wife? Don't worry. We gave her a nice honeymoon.
The cruelest of the villains in License to Kill for me, Benicio del Toro gives a solid performance early on in his career as Dario. On the surface, he's a devoted henchman that has a great affinity for Sanchez with a switchblade, which honestly doesn't sound all that unique. Yet 3 things really elevate him for me. First, his delivery of the honeymoon line is so disturbing and horrifying that it makes me sick. Second, he's the one that recognizes Bond at the end, and I love the way he plays out this reveal. He's able to call him out quietly without disturbing the business deal that's playing out in front of him, while also cueing in Sanchez that there's a problem. Finally, he stays behind at the expense of his own life to make sure Bond dies. These things, plus the affection that Sanchez displays for this guy, makes Dario a great presence in the film. I doubt anyone but die-hard fans of the series know about this guy, but he's the definition of a hidden gem to me. My holdup is that he's largely absent from huge chunks of the film that I sometimes forget he's even in the film. So I have to temper my enjoyment of him with that fact, and that's why he's not higher on this list. But I agree with all of his positives and only wish I could put him higher.
But of course, I forgot your ego, Mr. Bond. James Bond, who only has to make love to a woman and she starts to hear heavenly choir singing. She repents and immediately returns to the side of right and virtue. But not this one.
Geez, I love me some pure villainy in this series. Fiona Volpe has all the energy that Largo and his crew lack for me. She's devious, cold, sexy, and fun to watch. What more could you want? She arguably does more to carry out the Bond plot than Largo does in the film. If she wasn't killed off, I think I'd be able to make a solid case to Blofeld that someone needs a promotion with Inspector. I even love the idea of her death scene, which I interpret as Bond using her as a human shield, though I have to nitpick the lack of aftermath to her death. I don't mind that she's just sat next to an unaware couple, especially with the quip that Bond gives, but I just wish we had a quick scene of Largo discovering her death and being outraged by it. Coming after Tatiana Romanova and Pussy Galore, both whom are characters that start out aligned with the villains and then come over the Bond side, I love that we finally get a character who's immune to Bond's charms like that, which is a great subversion of our expectations. I know I've said it before, but some of the series' best characters are the female villains. And while Rosa Klebb was the breakthrough to that idea, I think the notion was really cemented with Fiona.
Oh, we're not sure about her. American. She's never far from him. Name's Mayday.
So now we've finally reached the top 5, and I doubt any of the choices here will shock anyone. Striking looks, a mostly nonchalantness about death, and a solid performance seem to be the keys to my heart when it comes to this category of henchmen, and Mayday certainly has those in spades. Grace Jones is a very weird out-of-left-field choice for casting in a Bond film, but it really works for me. Unlike another villain that we have yet to tackle on this list, I actually buy and like her switch at the end, though I don't think it's meant to redeem her entirely in our eyes. She's still a villain there, but she decides to work with Bond in order to get back at Zorin for leaving her to die. I have no doubt that if she survived, she'd still be a villain, and Bond would have to fight her again at some point. And that's the way I like my villain double crosses to work. I have mixed feelings about showing her in bed with Bond, but I totally buy that she would not be a submissive presence in bed. Much like Nack, she's a great pairing with her boss and helps to enrich a film that I personally have some issues with.
Many people have tried to involve themselves in my affairs, unsuccessfully.
Alongside the next entry on this list Oddjob is usually one of the first guys that comes to mind when you talk about Bond henchmen, and for good reason. Whereas some villains can get monologuing if you catch them at the right time of day, Oddjob doesn't say a thing, and he doesn't need to. You know he could break you without trying hard. The steel-rimmed hat is a little cartoonish, but it fits right in with Goldfinger's carefully judged tone. Bond needs the help of electricity to defeat this guy, since it was fairly obvious that he would never have won in a fair fight. Sometimes you need the immovable object to Bond's unstoppable force, and Oddjob fulfills that role beautifully. He's wholly loyal to Goldfinger and his plan, and will stop at nothing to make sure that those plans get carried out. Alongside GoldenEye in Live and Let Die, Goldfinger is among the films I would cite as having some of the best all-around casting in the series, and so Oddjob naturally comes highly in my estimation.
Now, regarding a replacement for Cha, you have someone in mind? Oh yes, well, if you can get him, of course.
Possibly the quintessential Bond henchman, Jaws is simply iconic. A towering silent giant would probably have been enough, but those steel teeth are the extra ingredient that makes the dish fantastic. They seem odd and unnerving at first, but they're deadly in a great over-the-top comic book kind of way. He has an outstanding balance of seriousness and camp to him in The Spy Who Loved Me. The pyramid scene there, and then the alley scene in Moonraker are some of the most chilling moments of the series for me, and it helps to cement Jaws as one of Bond's best adversaries. However, he does become a bit of an overplayed joke in Moonraker, and my problems with him there are threefold. I personally never wanted to hear him speak, they pushed the comedy too far with him, and his turn against Drax feels like a very corporate move to me. Kids like Jaws, so the producers needed to figure out a way to not have kids like an irredeemable bad guy. Much like Oddjob, Jaws is that example of an immovable object that I think the series needs occasionally in order to elicit genuine thrills from the audience, and the missteps taken with him in Moonraker keep him from being the outright best henchman in the series.
I have a small surprise from your friends back at the barracks.
You think I've gone to heaven?
Not yet.
As a kid, I was shocked by Xenia. After so many relatively tamer characters before her, where did this massive dose of insanity and creative risk come from? And now as an adult, I guess I'm still in shock that someone like Xenia is in this series. Sure, other villains like Miranda Frost, Electra King, and Fiona Volpe use sex as part of their methods to achieve their goals, but no one gets off on violence quite like Xenia. It's so insane, and yet I adore this character. Famke Janssen is having a ball with this role, and it's hard not to be swept up in the ecstasy. She's mental, dangerous, and can be absolutely chilling. Her murder of the technicians in Cervanaya is disturbing to the nth degree for me, and Ourumov has a similar reaction that I did. It doesn't come out of nowhere for the character, but until you're actually witnessing it, it's not something you ever thought you'd see in a Bond film up until this point. Like so many before her, my one slight nitpick is her death. I wish it was just a little longer. I love the actual death, being squeezed by a helicopter going down, but it's over a little too quickly for me to savor it. Xenia is just a bottle of crazy waiting to be let out, and she's definitely earned her place amongst the best henchmen of the series.
The first one won't kill you. Not the second. Not even the third. Not till you crawl over here and you kiss my foot.
So the top slot is almost always a matter of taste. Some people just like their henchmen a little bit more colorful like Xenia, while others prefer the strong imposing types like Oddjob or Gobinda. However, I'm a sucker for the two sides of the same coin people, and so Red Grant beats out everyone for my choice for the best henchman. Robert Shaw was a masterful character actor, and few bad guys afterwards nailed the darker side of Bond character as well as he did. I love just how casually he crops up in the film, and he serves as the constant reminder to the audience that Bond is an unwitting pawn in this chess match. If it wasn't for Q's briefcase, he would have killed Bond. He didn't really make mistakes before that, and I love that it's only his greed that brings about his downfall. In the novel, Grant was as good as he is here, and yet the get-out-of-jail-free card at the end was a little silly. Here, the explosion in the face is a tense resolution to the terrific standoff, which has some of the best writing in the series. Grant's reveling just twists the knife further for Bond. And the fight afterwards is one of the best fight scenes in any film, period. It's brutal, it's bloody, and it's just a treat to watch. Some villains just keep talking beyond the point of effectiveness, and here, Grant's lines are just perfect. He's definitely a contributor as to why From Russia with Love is one of my very favorite films in the series, and the subsequent entries didn't seem to forget him either, given that we've had at least 4 other big, tall, blonde muscle men on this list. Even amongst the main villains, the dark side of Bond characters rarely worked as well as it did with Grant, meaning that he would even outrank the majority of the main villains in the series, and that's why he deserves the #1 spot on my list. This has been my most requested video since doing the Bond villains ranking, and I've had a ball talking about many of the other characters that people thought should have been discussed over there. Which of these characters would be in your top 5? Is there someone that you would have picked for a placement on this list that I didn't mention? Much like how Doctor Who fans could never compile a satisfactory list of all the people that should count as companions, I'm not sure that I could have included everybody on this list that technically should be here, unless I wanted the video to be interminably long. I think it's great, though, that in a series with many incredible aspects, the Henchmen roster has produced a number of fantastic characters that many would rank over the main villains. James Bond has had to go up against a lot of heavy opposition in his quest to save the world, and we as a fan base have had such a great ride watching him face down some of the worst and most nefarious evildoers in cinema.